You need to get out. Thank you for everything. I don't need you anymore.
Don't do this for us. You will regret it.
The billionaire didn't just break up with her. Preston Vance physically evicted the mother of his child and their 5-year-old son directly into a raging storm to make space for his new fiancée. There was no negotiation and no mercy as he shoved Elena's vintage suitcase toward the open service elevator, the wind from the hurricane-force gale outside howling against the penthouse glass like a warning he was too arrogant to hear. He stood in the center of the living room, a scotch in one hand and a look of absolute disdain on his face, telling the woman who had supported him for 6 years that she was no longer compatible with his tax bracket. Before we watch Preston Vance lose his entire $4 billion empire to the very woman he just threw into the ring, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. If you became a billionaire tomorrow, would you leave your day one partner behind? Preston turned his back on them, walking over to where Isabella, his new fiancée, was lounging on a custom Italian sofa. She didn't even look up from her phone as Elena struggled to button their son Leo's coat with trembling hands. Preston made it clear that this wasn't just a breakup, it was a rebranding. He explained that investors were coming to the penthouse in less than 24 hours to celebrate the company's IPO, and he couldn't afford to have a dowdy, provincial woman and a crying child cluttering up the aesthetic. He claimed that Isabella projected the image of power and modern luxury he needed to secure his future, while Elena only reminded people of the struggles he wanted to forget. Elena stood by the freight elevator, the humiliation burning hotter than the tears she refused to shed. She looked at the man she once loved and quietly asked for just 12 hours. She pointed to the window, where the sky was pitch black and the rain was falling in horizontal sheets, flooding the streets of the city below. She pleaded for Leo's sake, asking Preston if he really wanted his son out in a Category 3 storm. Preston simply laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut through the room. He told her that if she was a better mother, she would have secured a backup plan instead of leeching off his success. He added that the sight of Leo made Isabella uncomfortable, and in this house, the new fiancé's comfort was the only law that mattered. He signaled to his private security guards, 2 massive men who looked ashamed to be following such orders. They stepped forward, crowding Elena and the boy toward the industrial steel doors of the service lift. Preston shouted over the thunder that she should be grateful he was letting them take the luggage at all. He threw a final insult at her, sneering that she belonged in the service elevator because she would never be anything more than the help in his life story. He told her to find a shelter and to never come back to his building again. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, severing the view of the warm, golden penthouse. The elevator descended with a grinding mechanical shriek, taking them down 70 floors to the basement loading dock. Elena held Leo tight against her side, whispering that everything was going to be fine, even though she had no idea where they would sleep. When the doors opened at the bottom, the smell of ozone and wet trash filled the air. They stepped out onto the concrete loading bay, and the storm hit them instantly. The wind was violent, nearly knocking the suitcase from Elena's grip. The rain wasn't just falling, it was attacking, soaking them to the bone in seconds. There were no taxis, no bystanders, and no mercy in the empty alleyway. They were completely alone in the freezing dark, evicted like unwanted refuse by a man who was currently popping a bottle of champagne 70 floors above their heads. Elena dragged the suitcase under the small, dripping awning of a boarded-up shop across the street to shield Leo from the worst of the deluge. She wiped the water from his frightened eyes and turned to look back up at the towering skyscraper that pierced the clouds. The penthouse lights were blazing, a symbol of the wealth Preston loved more than his own blood. He was up there right now, toasting to his freedom, believing he had just cut off a dead limb. But as the freezing rain ran down her face, Elena didn't break down. She reached into her soaked coat pocket and wrapped her fingers around her phone. Preston thought he had just evicted a helpless ex-girlfriend. He had no idea that the Solis name on the building's deed, the name he wrote his rent checks to every month, was her middle name. He thought he was the king of the castle, completely unaware that he had just declared war on the landlord. The neon sign of the Starlight Motel flickered with a dying buzz, the only source of light in a part of the city Preston Vance likely didn't even know existed. Elena Solis stood in the cramped, damp lobby, counting out crumpled bills from her coat pocket. Emergency cash she had hidden away for a rainy day, though she never imagined the rain would be this literal or this cruel. The night manager, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a decade, eyed her soaked designer coat and the shivering child at her side with suspicion, but he took the cash without asking questions. He slid a rusted key across the counter, the metal scratching against the formica like a warning. Elena didn't look at the roaches scattering when she turned on the light in room 104. She didn't look at the water stains on the ceiling or the threadbare carpet that smelled of stale smoke and regret. Her entire focus was on Leo. She stripped him of his wet clothes, wrapping him in the scratchy motel towels and tucking him into the sagging bed. He fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted by the trauma of being discarded by his father. It was only when his breathing evened out that Elena allowed herself to sit on the edge of the mattress and look at the phone in her hand. Preston was likely pouring his third glass of vintage scotch right now, laughing about how he had cleaned house. He probably thought Elena was crying in a gutter, helpless and broken. But he had made a fatal calculation error. He had mistaken silence for weakness. Elena dialed a number she hadn't used in 5 years. It wasn't a family member or a friend. It was a direct line to a firm on Wall Street that handled assets for the ultra-wealthy, specifically her assets. The phone rang once before being picked up. The voice on the other end was professional, sharp, and immediately alert. "Miss Solis, we haven't heard from you on this line since the merger. Is everything all right?" Elena walked to the window, pulling back the grimy curtain to watch the storm rage outside. She told the voice that everything was wrong. She explained, in a voice void of emotion, that the tenant in the penthouse of the Vance Tower had just violated the morality clause of his lease agreement. She detailed the eviction, the child endangerment, and the verbal abuse. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of typing, rapid, aggressive typing. The lawyer asked if she wanted them to initiate Protocol Red, which would freeze Preston's access to the building's amenities immediately. It was tempting. She could have shut off his elevators, cut his power, and locked him out of his own headquarters tonight. But Elena knew that true justice wasn't about a quick jab. It was about the knockout blow. She told the lawyer to wait. She wanted Preston to feel safe. She wanted him to sign the lease renewal papers that were sitting on his desk. She wanted him to commit fraud on public record before she pulled the rug out. She instructed the team to prepare a full audit of every dime Preston had ever spent in her building and to have the eviction notice ready for the board meeting. The lawyer agreed, his tone shifting from concern to professional ruthlessness. "We will begin the paper trail tonight, Miss Solis. He won't even know he's bleeding until he's dead." Elena hung up the phone and looked back at her sleeping son. Preston Vance believed he had thrown them into the storm to die. He had no clue that the storm was actually inside the room with him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Back in the penthouse, the storm was nothing more than ambient noise, a dramatic backdrop for the celebration of a new era. Isabella was already making her mark on the space, walking through the living room with a glass of champagne in one hand, pointing out everything she wanted removed. She told Preston that the curtains were too heavy, the art was too depressing, and the entire guest wing smelled like middle-class desperation. She was erasing Elena and Leo from the apartment as if they were nothing more than outdated furniture. Preston followed her around, nodding, intoxicated by her cruelty because he mistook it for sophistication. He felt invincible. The eviction of his ex-partner felt like shedding dead weight. He told Isabella that this was just the beginning. With the IPO launching next week, he would be a billionaire on paper, not just in assets. He bragged that he was going to buy the building outright next year, claiming the current landlord was some faceless holding company that never paid attention to anything. He laughed, saying he had been subletting 3 floors to a crypto mining farm without the landlord noticing, a clear violation of his contract that would have terrified a smarter man. But Preston wasn't smart. He was just loud. He had no idea that a red notification light was currently blinking on the server of that faceless holding company, flagging his subletting confession as evidence item number 1. As they sat down to a dinner prepared by a private chef, a young assistant scurried into the room, looking pale. He held a tablet out to Preston, apologizing for the interruption. The assistant explained that a courier had just delivered a priority envelope from Solis Holdings, the building's owner. It was marked urgent, lease compliance. For a split second, the air in the room shifted. A smarter man would have opened that envelope immediately. A smarter man would have wondered why the landlord was sending urgent mail at 9 p.m. during a storm. But Preston was drunk on his own ego. He waved the assistant away, telling him to put it with the rest of the administrative junk. He told Isabella that the landlord was probably just begging for a rent increase, which he would negotiate down like he always did. He grabbed Isabella's hand and kissed it, declaring that tonight was about them, not about boring paperwork. The assistant hesitated, knowing that urgent usually meant trouble, but he retreated, leaving the red envelope sitting on the edge of the hallway console table. That envelope contained a notice of breach, the first legal step required to strip Preston of his home and his business headquarters. By ignoring it, Preston had just waived his right to contest the eviction. He poured another glass of wine, smiling at his new fiancée, completely unaware that he had just signed his own death warrant. He toasted to the future, blind to the fact that his future was currently sitting in a motel room, plotting the exact dimensions of his grave. The morning sun hit the glass walls of the Vance Tower, but it brought no warmth to the situation unfolding inside. Preston woke up with a headache, not from the alcohol, but from a frantic call from his PR manager. The manager, a woman who specialized in burying scandals, was panicking. She told Preston that a photo had surfaced on a small, local blog. It was a grainy image taken from a distance, showing a woman and a child standing in the rain with a suitcase, looking up at the penthouse. The caption read, "Billionaire throws family out in storm." It hadn't gone viral yet. It had less than 100 likes, but the potential for damage was catastrophic. Preston paced the living room, his face red with rage. He didn't care that Leo had been cold. He didn't care that Elena was homeless. He cared that he looked like a villain right before his IPO. He screamed at the PR manager to kill the story, to buy the blog, to do whatever it took. But then a darker thought crossed his mind. If Elena was desperate, she might go to the mainstream press. She might sell her story for money. He decided to strike first. He pulled up Elena's number, ready to bully her into submission. He expected her to be crying. He expected her to beg for forgiveness or money. When she answered, however, her voice was calm, unnervingly calm. Preston didn't let her speak. He launched into a tirade, threatening her. He told her that if she leaked one word to the press, he would sue her for defamation. He told her he would hire the best lawyers in the country to prove she was an unfit mother who dragged her child into a storm for a photo op. "I will take Leo," Preston hissed into the phone. "I will take full custody, and I will make sure you never see him again. You don't have the money to fight me, Elena. I can drag this out in court until you starve." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Preston smirked, thinking he had won, thinking he had terrified her into silence. But then, Elena spoke. She didn't sound scared. She sounded like a judge reading a verdict. "You're right, Preston," she said, her voice crystal clear. "I don't want to fight you in the press. I think we should handle this legally. If you want a war, we can do it by the book." Preston laughed, mocking her. "You can't afford a lawyer, Elena." "I guess we'll see," she replied, and hung up. Preston tossed his phone onto the couch, turning to Isabella with a smug grin. He told her handled it. He told her Elena was bluffing and would probably crawl back to beg for a settlement in a few days. He was so focused on his perceived victory that he didn't notice the second email that pinged on his tablet, a notification from the building's security system authorizing a full site inspection by the owner's representatives for the following morning. He thought he had silenced a helpless woman. He didn't realize he had just invited the CEO of Solis Holdings to inspect his crimes in person. The trap wasn't just set. Preston had just walked right into the center of it and locked the door behind him. 36 hours after being thrown onto the street, Elena Solis walked into the gleaming glass headquarters of Solis Holdings. She wasn't wearing the soaking wet coat from the night of the storm, nor was she wearing the modest department store clothes Preston despised. She was wearing a hoodie and sunglasses, keeping her head down as she bypassed the main reception desk where security guards, who were trained to stop anyone without a badge, stepped aside with terrified reverence the moment they recognized her profile. To the outside world, she was a ghost, a recluse heiress who never gave interviews. To the staff inside this building, she was the Iron Lady, a woman who could dismantle a company with a single signature. Preston Vance thought she was currently filling out welfare applications. He didn't know she was about to walk into a boardroom to authorize a forensic audit of his entire life. She took the private elevator to the 50th floor. When the doors opened, the atmosphere changed instantly. The chaos of the city below was replaced by the hushed, expensive silence of high-stakes litigation. 5 of the city's most expensive corporate lawyers were already seated at a mahogany table, files spread out before them. They stood up in unison as Elena entered. There were no pleasantries, no small talk about the weather. Elena pulled back her hood, revealing eyes that were tired but burning with a cold, calculated fury. She sat at the head of the table and slid a single piece of paper across the wood. The eviction notice Preston had verbally given her. The lead attorney, a man named Marcus who had destroyed hedge funds for sport, picked up the paper. He informed Elena that they had already begun the preliminary dig into Vance Tech's residency at their uptown property. What they found wasn't just a violation, it was a gold mine of leverage. Marcus explained that Preston had become sloppy in his arrogance. He hadn't just been rude, he had been criminally negligent. The terms of his lease for the penthouse and the corporate offices below explicitly forbade subletting or modifying the electrical grid without owner approval. Elena leaned forward, her voice low. She asked for the specifics. Marcus smiled, a predator sensing blood. He revealed that the thermal imaging scans of the Vance Tower showed massive heat signatures coming from the 40th floor, a floor listed as storage on the lease. In reality, Preston had secretly installed a massive server farm for crypto mining, siphoning electricity from the building's main grid to cut his own costs. He was stealing power from Solis Holdings to pad his own pockets. It was the smoking gun. Elena didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply tapped her finger on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. She told them to document everything. She wanted photos, power grid readings, and witness statements. She ordered them to prepare a breach of contract, filing so airtight that not even God could get Preston out of it. But she gave them one specific instruction: do not file it yet. He has a board meeting in 3 weeks, Elena said, staring at the skyline. He needs to sign the lease renewal first. I want him to commit to the building for another 10 years, personally guaranteeing the rent with his own assets. Once he signs that, we drop the hammer. The lawyers nodded, understanding the cruelty of the plan. She wasn't just kicking him out. She was going to let him shackle himself to a sinking ship first. As the meeting adjourned, Elena stood up. She had one more stop to make. She told Marcus she needed a uniform, a janitor's uniform. If Preston wanted to treat her like the help, she would play the part, right up until she owned him. The lobby of the Vance Tower was a monument to Preston's ego, filled with oversized portraits of himself and gold-plated fixtures. It was also the scene of his next great mistake. Preston was striding through the atrium with his entourage, laughing loudly at a joke one of his sycophants had made about cutting dead weight. He was heading toward the revolving doors, feeling like the king of New York. The storm had passed, the sun was shining, and his IPO was trending on social media. He was so busy looking at his own reflection in the glass that he almost tripped over the woman scrubbing a scuff mark on the floor near the service entrance. Preston stopped, annoyed that the cleaning staff was in his line of sight during business hours. He looked down, ready to fire someone for incompetence, when the woman looked up. It was Elena. She was wearing a gray maintenance jumpsuit, her hair tied back in a messy bun, holding a spray bottle and a rag. For a second, Preston was stunned into silence. The sight of his ex-partner, the mother of his child, scrubbing floors in the very building he lived in was jarring. But then, the shock was replaced by a wave of sickening delight. He didn't know she was wearing the uniform as a disguise to inspect the lobby's structural maintenance logs. He assumed she had hit rock bottom. He assumed this was the only job she could get. A cruel smile spread across his face. He signaled for his entourage to stop, wanting an audience for this moment. He walked over to her, his Italian leather shoes clicking on the marble she was cleaning. Well, Preston sneered, his voice dripping with mock pity. I knew you were desperate, Elena, but I didn't think you'd be back this soon. Cleaning my floors? Really? Is this your way of trying to stay close to me? Elena stood up slowly. She didn't look ashamed. She looked at him with an unreadable expression. She didn't speak. She knew that if she opened her mouth, she might accidentally reveal that she could buy this entire lobby with the change in her pocket. She let him talk. She let him dig the hole deeper. Preston laughed, playing to the crowd of nervous junior executives behind him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He crumpled it up into a ball and tossed it at her. It hit her chest and fell to the floor, landing right next to the bucket of dirty water. "Here," he said, loud enough for the receptionist to hear. "Buy Leo a new toy. Consider it a tip for whatever this is. But do a better job on the corners, sweetheart. I hate streaks." The entourage chuckled nervously, terrified of Preston but compelled to play along. Elena looked down at the money. She didn't pick it up. She looked back at Preston, memorizing the arrogant tilt of his chin, the way he thought he was untouchable. She simply nodded, a gesture he took for submission but was actually a silent confirmation that he was irredeemable. "Enjoy your day, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice flat. "The building has a way of surprising you when you least expect it." Preston snorted, dismissing her as he pushed through the revolving doors. He didn't see her pick up her phone the second he was outside. He didn't hear her call the building manager and say, "The lobby floors are marble, grade A. Make sure the tenant is billed for the scuff marks his shoes just made." Preston walked away thinking he had won the interaction, completely unaware that the janitor he just humiliated was about to own the sidewalk he was walking on. That night, the temperature in the city dropped again, a bitter cold front following the storm. In the penthouse, Preston Vance was furious. He was standing in the middle of his living room wrapped in a cashmere blanket, shivering. The state-of-the-art heating system in the penthouse, the one he bragged was smart and controlled by AI, had completely failed. The temperature inside the glass-walled apartment was hovering near freezing. Isabella was in the bedroom, complaining loudly that she couldn't sleep in an icebox and threatening to go to a hotel. Preston was screaming into his phone, berating the building manager, a man named Mr. Henderson. "Do you know who I am?" Preston shouted, his breath visible in the cold air of his own living room. "I pay $50,000 a month for this unit. Fix the damn heat, or I will have your job." On the other end of the line, sitting in a warm, comfortable office in the basement, Mr. Henderson was struggling to keep the smile out of his voice. Mr. Henderson knew exactly who Preston was. He also knew who Elena was. In fact, he had just gotten off the phone with Elena 10 minutes ago. The malfunction in the penthouse wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a targeted shutdown. Solis Holdings had remote access to the building's environmental controls, and Elena had suggested that perhaps a stress test of the HVAC system was necessary for the top floor. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Vance," Henderson said, his tone perfectly professional. "But the system shows irregularities. It seems to be drawing too much power from unapproved sources. Perhaps the servers you have running are interfering with the residential grid." Preston froze. The mention of the servers, the illegal crypto farm he had hidden, sent a spike of panic through his chest. He quickly changed his tone, trying to bluff. "That's ridiculous. There are no servers. Just fix the heat. I'm afraid I can't override the safety lockout without the owner's direct code." Henderson lied smoothly. "The system has flagged your unit for a compliance check. I've sent a request to the landlord, but, well, you know how these billionaires are. They take their time." Preston slammed the phone down, shaking with rage and cold. He was trapped. He couldn't call an outside repairman because they would see the illegal server setup. He was at the mercy of a landlord he considered a non-entity. He poured himself a drink to stay warm, looking out at the city lights. He felt persecuted. He felt like the universe was conspiring against him. He had no idea how right he was. 70 floors below, inside the building's server room, a diagnostic log was being printed. It showed the exact time the heat was cut, authorized by user ID, Solis. Preston was shivering in a $4 million apartment, while the woman he evicted was sleeping soundly in a warm bed, her finger hovering over the button for his water supply next. The heat was off, but for Preston Vance, the fire was just getting started. Preston Vance didn't just want to win. He wanted to parade his victory around in a gold-plated chariot. The upcoming engagement party was not merely a celebration of his love for Isabella. It was a strategic coronation. He had rented out the grand ballroom of the plaza, hired a Michelin star chef to create a menu based on Isabella's favorite colors, and invited every major player in the tech industry. It was going to be the event of the season, a night of obscene wealth and carefully curated perfection. But as Preston looked over the guest list with a glass of wine in hand, he felt something was missing. He needed a contrast. He needed someone to witness his ascent who would truly feel the weight of it. He thought of Elena. Most men would want their ex-partners as far away as possible during an engagement party. But Preston was a narcissist of the highest order. He wanted Elena there. He wanted her to see Isabella in a $50,000 gown. He wanted her to see the investors fawning over him. He wanted her to stand in the corner, holding a cheap purse, realizing exactly what she had lost. He called his assistant and ordered a special courier. He dictated the invitation personally. He didn't send a standard card. He sent a VIP guest package, but he included a handwritten note on his personal stationery. The note was cruel in its brevity. Come see what success looks like. Bring Leo if you can find a babysitter who works for minimum wage. It was a taunt disguised as hospitality. He assumed she wouldn't come. He assumed she would be too ashamed to show her face in high society after being evicted. But sending the invite gave him a thrill, a sense of dominance that was more intoxicating than the alcohol. When the courier arrived at the motel, Preston had tracked her down through the credit card she used to check in. Elena was sitting at the small desk, reviewing a portfolio of acquisition targets for Solis Holdings. She took the velvet-lined envelope from the courier, who looked out of place in the dingy hallway. She opened it, reading Preston's note. A normal person would have torn it up. A normal person would have cried. Elena didn't do either. She laughed. It was a soft, dark laugh. She realized that Preston wasn't just arrogant. He was suicidal. He was inviting the executioner to his own funeral. She looked at the RSVP card. It asked for the number of guests. She picked up a pen, the ink flowing smoothly as she checked the box for accept. But she didn't stop there. Under the section for dietary restrictions, she wrote, allergic to bullshit. And under the section for +1, she checked yes. Preston received the notification of her acceptance the next morning. He was stunned, then amused. He showed Isabella, joking that Elena was probably coming to beg for a handout or to steal leftovers. He wondered who she would bring. Probably some loser she met at the motel, or maybe she would come alone and claim her +1 couldn't make it. He felt a surge of anticipation. He couldn't wait to see her humiliated in front of the city's elite. He had no idea that Elena's +1 wasn't a date. It wasn't a boyfriend. She intended to bring the chairman of the board of the Solis Real Estate Group, the man who held the legal authority to dissolve Preston's lease on the spot. She wasn't coming to eat his food. She was coming to inspect her property. Preston finalized the seating chart, placing Elena at a table in the back, near the kitchen doors. He thought he was putting her in her place. He didn't know he was positioning the predator exactly where she needed to be to watch the prey. The arrogance of Preston Vance knew no bounds, but his pettiness was even infinite. A few days after sending the invitation, he was driving his Aston Martin through the downtown district, a trendy area filled with artisanal shops and cafes. When he saw her, he slammed on the brakes, causing the taxi behind him to honk aggressively. There, through the large glass window of the Daily Grind, a popular coffee spot, was Elena. She was standing behind the counter, wearing an apron, handing a latte to a customer. Preston pulled the car over, ignoring the no parking sign. He watched her for a moment, a twisted smile spreading across his face. He assumed she had taken a minimum wage job as a barista to make ends meet. It fit his narrative perfectly. The woman who once shared his penthouse was now serving coffee to hipsters. He could have just driven away, satisfied with his superiority. But Preston was a bully who liked to kick people when they were down. He wanted to take this from her, too. He pulled out his phone and searched for the number of the cafe. He wasn't going to go in and cause a scene. That was too messy. He was going to get her fired from the comfort of his leather seat. He dialed the number. When an employee answered, Preston demanded to speak to the owner immediately. He used his CEO voice, the one that usually made subordinates tremble. When a man's voice came on the line, claiming to be the manager, Preston launched into a fabricated story. He claimed he had just visited the shop and was appalled by the service of the woman with the dark hair working the counter. He lied about her being rude, claimed she had spilled coffee on his suit, and insisted she was stealing from the tip jar. "I am a very powerful man in this city," Preston threatened, watching Elena through the window as she laughed with a customer. "If she is still employed there by the end of the day, I will make sure every health inspector in the state pays you a visit. Do you understand me? Fire her." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Preston smirked, waiting for the groveling apology. He expected the manager to promise immediate action, but the voice on the other end sounded confused, almost bemused. "Sir," the manager said slowly, "I think you have a misunderstanding. The woman you are describing, Miss Solis." "Yes, Elena Solis." Preston snapped. "Get rid of her." "I can't fire her, sir," the manager replied, his voice breaking up slightly as Preston drove into a tunnel, losing signal. "Miss Solis isn't an employee. She bought the building last week. She's just checking the new espresso machine." The signal cut out. Static filled the car. Preston pulled the phone away from his ear, frowning. He hadn't heard the last part. All he heard was, "I can't fire her." He assumed the manager was being stubborn. He threw the phone onto the passenger's seat, cursing. "Fine," he muttered to himself. "If they won't fire her, I'll just buy the damn coffee shop and fire her myself." He drove away, fuming, completely unaware of the reality. Elena wasn't working for tips. She had purchased the entire city block as part of a portfolio expansion for Leo's trust fund. She was behind the counter because she liked the smell of coffee and wanted to test the new machines she had ordered for her staff. Preston had just tried to get the owner fired from her. The first crack in the dam appeared on a Wednesday morning, 3 days before the engagement party. It wasn't a lawsuit or an arrest warrant. It was a whisper. A niche financial blog, known for deep-dive investigative journalism, published a short article titled, "The Emperor Has No Lease. Is Vance Tech Homeless?" The article cited anonymous sources claiming that Preston Vance's lease on his headquarters was not only up for renewal, but was actively being contested by the landlord due to multiple breaches of contract. For a tech company about to IPO, stability is everything. The rumor spread like wildfire. By noon, #VanceHomeless was trending on Twitter. Investors began calling, their voices tight with panic. If Vance Tech lost its headquarters, the logistics of moving the servers and the staff would cripple their quarterly earnings. The stock price took a tentative dip. Preston was in damage control mode. He sat in his boardroom, sweating through his custom shirt, screaming at his legal team. "Who leaked this?" he roared. "Who told them the lease is up?" He suspected a corporate rival. He suspected a disgruntled employee. He never once suspected the woman he had evicted, because in his mind, she didn't have access to this kind of information. He decided to kill the rumor the only way he knew how, with a bold-faced lie. He called an emergency press conference in the lobby of the tower. Dozens of reporters gathered, microphones thrust forward. Preston stood at the podium, projecting absolute confidence. He smiled, adjusted his tie, and looked directly into the cameras. "These rumors are baseless slander," Preston declared, his voice booming. "Vance Tech is not only secure in this location, but I am currently in the final stages of purchasing the tower. The landlord and I are on excellent terms. This building will soon carry the Vance name permanently." It was a lie so massive it sucked the air out of the room. The reporters scribbled furiously. The stock price stabilized. Preston walked off the stage feeling like a genius. He figured he could bully the landlord into selling later. He just needed to survive the week. Across town, in a high-rise office with a view that dwarfed Preston's, Elena Solis was watching the live stream on a tablet. She was sitting in a leather chair, her legs crossed, holding a physical document in her hand. It was the deed to the building. It was the original, stamped, and notarized proof of ownership. She listened to Preston lie to the world. She listened to him claim he was on excellent terms with the landlord. She looked down at the deed, then at the phone. She typed a text message to Marcus, her lead attorney. "Did you hear that, Marcus? He says we're on excellent terms." Marcus replied instantly. "Shall we release the statement denying the sale?" Elena typed back, "No. Let him lie. Let the investors buy in based on that lie. When we expose him, it won't just be an eviction. It will be securities fraud. He's digging his own grave with a microphone. Let him keep talking." She turned off the tablet. Preston had just committed a felony on live television. The trap was no longer just about taking his home. Now, it was about taking his freedom. The penthouse was quiet, a rare occurrence in the life of Preston Vance. Isabella sat at the marble kitchen island, sipping a detox smoothie that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. She was scrolling through her phone, checking the engagement announcement likes, but her eyes kept drifting to the pile of mail the housekeeper had left on the counter. Usually, Preston's mail was screened by his assistants at the office, but for some reason, a specific bundle had been delivered directly to the residence. It was mostly high-end catalogs and invitations to galas, the kind of fluff that validated their status. But one envelope stood out. It was thick, cream-colored linen paper, embossed with a gold logo, a stylized sun rising over a skyscraper. The return address simply read, Solis Holdings, Legal Department. Isabella frowned. She knew the name Solis. Everyone in the city knew the name Solis. They were the invisible giants of real estate, the old money that made the new tech billionaires look like children playing with monopoly money. Why would the legal department of the city's largest landlord be writing to Preston at home? She picked it up. It was heavy. It felt like a threat. Just then, Preston walked in, talking loudly on his headset about synergy and market disruption. He hung up, kissed Isabella on the cheek, and grabbed an apple. He was in a good mood, riding the high of his lie from the press conference. He saw Isabella holding the envelope and laughed. "Toss that," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's just junk mail. Probably begging for a donation or trying to sell me insurance." Isabella didn't toss it. She ran her manicured nail along the seal. "It's from Solis Holdings, Preston, the legal department. This doesn't look like junk mail. It looks like a lawsuit." Preston's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of fear that he quickly covered with arrogance. He snatched the envelope from her hand, but he didn't open it. He walked over to the trash compactor. He told her that Solis was just the management company for the building and that they were annoying bureaucrats who sent notices about everything from recycling policies to window washing schedules. He called them paper pushers who were jealous of men of action like him. He threw the unopened envelope into the trash. The compactor whirred to life, crushing the heavy linen paper into a cube of garbage. "Don't worry your pretty head about business, babe," Preston said, winking at her. "I own this town. Solis works for me." He left the room to take a shower, whistling. But Isabella stayed in the kitchen. She wasn't a genius, but she was a survivor. She had attached herself to Preston because he was a rising star, a safe bet. But staring at the trash compactor, she felt a cold knot in her stomach. Successful billionaires didn't get legal notices at their home address, and they certainly didn't throw them away unopened with shaking hands. She walked over to the trash, hesitated, and then stopped. She didn't retrieve it. That was too messy. But she made a mental note. Preston was hiding something. The confident facade was showing hairline cracks. She pulled up her banking app on her phone and quietly transferred a significant chunk of her allowance into a private offshore account he didn't know about. If the ship was sinking, Isabella wasn't going to be the one drowning in the orchestra pit. She was going to be on the first lifeboat. 5 days passed. The tension in the city was palpable as the storm clouds cleared, but for Elena, the only date that mattered was the 14th of the month. It was Leo's 6th birthday. For years, Preston had treated his son's birthday as an inconvenience, a date his assistant would remind him of so he could have a generic gift sent via courier. This year, Preston didn't even do that. He was too busy courting investors and fighting the invisible war for his lease. The day came and went without a single text, call, or card from the father who lived in a penthouse towering over the city. Preston had forgotten his son existed. Elena decided to remind him, not with a phone call, but with a display of power that would leave him scratching his head. Elena didn't throw a pity party in a motel room. She rented out the entire Galactic Air and Space Museum for a private event. She hired actors to play astronauts, commissioned a cake that was an exact replica of the Mars rover, and invited every child from Leo's old kindergarten class. The same elite private school Preston had pulled him out of when he kicked them out, claiming he wasn't paying tuition for a kid who didn't live with him. The party was spectacular. It was the kind of event that cost $50,000 minimum. Elena paid for it with a single swipe of her black card, the transaction barely registering against the interest her trust fund had earned that morning. She took photos, glorious, high-definition photos of Leo laughing, wearing a custom space suit, surrounded by joy. She posted them on a private Instagram account, knowing full well that the mother of one of Leo's classmates was a gossip who followed Preston. The bait was taken within hours. Preston was sitting in his office, drinking stale coffee, when his phone pinged. It was a screenshot sent by the gossip, captioned, "Wow, look at Leo's party. I thought you said things were tight with Elena." This looks more expensive than my wedding. Preston stared at the image. He zoomed in on the background. He saw the museum, which was closed to the public for the event. He saw the catering staff. He saw the sheer scale of the wealth on display. His brain couldn't compute it. He knew he had evicted her. He knew she had no job. He knew he had cut off her credit cards. So how? A dark, twisted logic took hold of him. He didn't think, maybe she has her own money. That was impossible in his worldview. He immediately jumped to the only conclusion his misogynistic mind could process. She must have found a man. A rich man. She's a gold digger. Preston muttered to the empty room, slamming his fist on the desk. She found some old sugar daddy to pay for all this, just to spite me. The thought drove him mad with jealousy. Not because he wanted her back, but because he considered her his property to discard. If she was thriving, it meant she had won. He paced the office, ignoring the pile of legal notices on his desk. He decided he needed to know who was funding this. He needed to find this mystery man and expose Elena as a whore who was using her son to trap a new wallet. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had used in his shadier business dealings. "Get me a private investigator," Preston ordered. "I need dirt on my ex. She's getting money from somewhere, and I want to know who he is." The private investigator, a man named Miller who charged by the hour and didn't ask moral questions, spent the next 3 days trailing Elena Solis. He expected a standard cheating ex routine. He expected to see her meeting men in hotel bars or sneaking into mansions in the Hamptons. He was prepared to take grainy photos of illicit affairs. But what he found didn't make sense. In fact, it was baffling. Miller sat in Preston's office 48 hours later, looking uncomfortable. He tossed a manila folder onto the glass desk. Preston grabbed it eagerly, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Well, who is he? Is it some hedge fund guy? A rival CEO?" Miller shook his head, scratching his chin. "There is no guy, Mr. Vance. I've been on her 24/7. She hasn't been on a date. She hasn't even spoken to a man socially." Preston frowned, flipping through the photos. They showed Elena walking down the street, Elena entering a building, Elena sitting in a park. "Then where is the money coming from? Did you track her movements?" "Yeah, I tracked her," Miller said, pointing to a photo of Elena entering a massive limestone building with brass doors. "She goes to the First National Bank private client entrance. Not the lobby, the private entrance around the side. She was in there for 2 hours. Maybe she's getting a loan?" Preston suggested, grasping at straws. "You don't get into that and transfer a loan, boss," Miller said dryly. "You get in there if your net worth has 8 zeros. And then," he pointed to another photo. "She went here. The offices of Sterling, Cooper, and Katz. Top-tier corporate law. She's suing me," Preston realized, his face paling. "She's using a lawyer to sue me for alimony." "I don't think so," Miller corrected him. "I asked around the building security. She didn't go to the family law floor. She went to the mergers and acquisitions floor." Preston stared at the investigator. "Mergers and acquisitions? She's a housewife, Miller. She doesn't have a job. Why would she be in a meeting about corporate mergers?" "I don't know what to tell you," Miller said, standing up. "But she walks into these places like she owns them. The doormen wave her in. No ID checks. No appointments. It's weird. It's like she's a ghost in the system. I couldn't find an employment record, but she's definitely not broke. She tipped a valet $100 yesterday just for holding the door." Preston threw the file across the room. He refused to see the truth. His ego wouldn't let him accept that Elena was powerful. He spun a new narrative in his head instantly. "She's a mule," Preston declared, his eyes manic. "She's laundering money. That's why she's at the banks. That's why she's dealing with corporate lawyers to set up shell companies. She's got herself mixed up in something illegal to keep up appearances." He smiled, a cruel, predatory smile. This was better than a sugar daddy. If she was a criminal, he could destroy her completely. "Keep watching her," Preston ordered. "If she's moving dirty money, I'm going to catch her. And when I do, I'm not just taking the apartment back. I'm taking Leo. No judge will give custody to a felon." Miller nodded and left, taking the check. He didn't tell Preston that the dirty money he suspected was actually the legitimate dividends of a $4 billion real estate empire. He just took the cash and left the billionaire to his delusions. Preston sat back, feeling triumphant. He thought he had found her weak spot. In reality, he had just decided to investigate the very hand that fed him, ensuring that when the slap came, it would knock his head clean off. Armed with his investigators' evidence and a heart full of malice, Preston decided to ambush Elena. He didn't call her. He tracked her. Miller, the private eye, had tipped him off that Elena took Leo to Central Park every Tuesday afternoon near the duck pond, a habit she had kept since Leo was a baby. Preston drove his Aston Martin to the edge of the park, parking illegally because he believed traffic laws were for poor people, and stormed into the greenery. He spotted them easily. Elena was sitting on a bench, reading a book, while Leo threw breadcrumbs into the water. The scene was peaceful, idyllic even, which only made Preston angrier. How dare she look so serene while he was stressing about leaks and stock prices? He marched up to the bench, his shadow falling over her like a thundercloud. He expected her to jump, to look guilty. Instead, she simply marked her page and looked up at him through her sunglasses. Preston didn't waste time with pleasantries. He leaned down, invading her personal space, and hissed that he knew her secret. He told her he knew about the bank visits, the M&A lawyers, and the sudden influx of cash. He laid out his theory with absolute conviction. She was laundering money for criminals. He called her a mule and a disgrace. He told her that he had a file thick enough to send her to federal prison for 10 years, and when that happened, he would be there to take Leo. He claimed that a child shouldn't be raised by a felon, completely ignoring the irony that his own business practices were currently under secret investigation for fraud. Elena listened to his rant without blinking. She looked at the man who was practically foaming at the mouth with delusion. She could have ended it right there. She could have pulled out her phone, logged into her bank app, and showed him that the laundering was actually quarterly dividends from the Solis Group, which totaled more than his company's entire annual revenue. She could have told him that the M&A lawyers were working on acquiring his competitors. But she knew that revealing the truth now would ruin the trap. She needed him to feel powerful. She needed him to overreach. So, she played the part. She stood up, shielding Leo from his father's aggression, and told him to leave them alone. She warned him that if he continued to harass them, she would contact the authorities. Preston laughed in her face. He told her that the authorities worked for people like him, not people like her. He pointed a finger in her face and gave her an ultimatum. Disappear, leave the city, or he would release the evidence to the FBI and have her arrested. You're playing a dangerous game, Elena, Preston sneered, adjusting his suit jacket. You think you can outsmart me? I have the money. I have the power. Even your landlord loves me. I'm the best tenant in the building. You're nobody. Elena watched him turn and walk away, strutting like a peacock. She waited until he was out of earshot before she sat back down. She stroked Leo's hair to calm him down, her eyes fixed on Preston's retreating figure. She whispered to the air, "The landlord doesn't love you, Preston. The landlord is currently drafting your eviction notice." He had just threatened the one person who held the keys to his kingdom, and he was too blind to see the guillotine hanging over his neck. 2 nights later, Preston was hosting the most critical dinner party of his career. He had invited the top 3 angel investors in the city to the penthouse. The goal was to secure an emergency injection of cash to stabilize the company's stock before the IPO. The table was set with platinum-rimmed china, the wine was older than the United States, and Isabella was wearing a dress that cost as much as a Honda Civic. The atmosphere was tense but controlled. Preston was in the middle of a charming anecdote about his humble beginnings, lying through his teeth to impress the men who held the checkbooks. And then, darkness. It wasn't a flicker. It was a total, instantaneous blackout. The music cut. The lights died. The smart fridge hum ceased. The penthouse was plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. The only light came from the city skyline outside the windows. Ironically, the rest of the city, and even the rest of the Vance Tower, was fully lit. It was only the penthouse that had gone dark. Panic ensued. Isabella screamed, dropping her wine glass, which shattered loudly in the dark. The investors grumbled, pulling out their phones to use as flashlights, casting eerie, unflattering shadows across the room. Preston was mortified. He shouted for his AI assistant to turn on the emergency lights, but the system was dead. He fumbled his way to the wall panel, frantically tapping it. Nothing. It must be a grid failure, Preston stammered, trying to keep the investors calm. The whole block must be out. One of the investors walked to the window. "No, Preston," he said, pointing to the street below. "The streetlights are on. The lobby is on. Even the floor below us is on. It's just you. Preston felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. This was impossible. The building had triple redundancy generators. Unless someone had manually severed the connection. He grabbed his phone and called the building manager, screaming into the receiver. Turn the power back on. I have billionaires in my living room. The manager's voice was apologetic but unhelpful. I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. The system shows a smart meter disconnect. It usually happens when an account is flagged for suspicious activity or non-payment. I can't override it until the morning. I own this company. Preston roared. I don't have non-payment issues. But the damage was done. The investors were not impressed. Sitting in the dark, eating cold food, they saw Preston not as a titan of industry, but as a man who couldn't even keep the lights on in his own home. They excused themselves early, navigating the dark hallway with their cell phone lights, leaving Preston standing alone in the shadows. He threw his phone across the room, cursing the incompetence of the electric company. He didn't know that 3 miles away, in a cozy, well-lit apartment, Elena Solis was sitting on her sofa with a glass of red wine. In her hand was a tablet connected to the Solis Holdings central infrastructure grid. On the screen was a simple toggle switch labeled Unit 700, Penthouse, Main Power. The switch was set to OFF. She took a sip of wine, watched the digital clock tick, and decided she would let him sweat for another hour before she flipped it back on. It wasn't about the electricity. It was about showing him that his world could be turned off with the push of a button. The morning after the blackout, Preston arrived at his office looking like a man on the edge of a breakdown. He hadn't slept. The investors had pulled out of the deal, citing instability. His stock was down another 4%. He needed a win. He needed security. He sat at his desk, rubbing his temples, when his secretary walked in with a thick, leather-bound document. This just arrived via specialized courier, Mr. Vance, she said, placing it gently on the desk, as if it were a bomb. It's the lease renewal from Solis Holdings. Preston exhaled. Finally, he snatched the document. He assumed it would be a standard renewal, maybe a 5% rent increase, which he would complain about but pay. He opened the folder. He skipped the legal jargon and went straight to the terms page. His eyes bulged. He stopped breathing. The new rent wasn't 5% higher. It was 300% higher. And that wasn't the worst part. The terms included a retroactive maintenance fee of $12 million for unauthorized server usage, a reputational damage clause demanding immediate public retraction of his press conference lies, and, most insulting of all, a clause that gave the landlord the right to inspect the premises at any time, without notice. This is insane, Preston screamed, throwing the document at the wall. This is extortion. Who do they think they are? He grabbed his phone and dialed the number on the letterhead. He didn't get a secretary. He got a voicemail for the executive office of the chairman. He left a message that was half threat, half begging. He demanded a meeting. He demanded to speak to Mr. Solis face to face. He shouted that he was the most important tenant in the building and he wouldn't be bullied by some senile old man. 10 minutes later, his phone rang. It was a block number. Mr. Vance, a cool, synthesized voice said. The chairman has received your request. He agrees that a face-to-face meeting is overdue. Good, Preston snapped. When? I want him in my office today. The chairman does not come to you, the voice replied. You will come to the Solis boardroom on Friday at 9 a.m. Be punctual. And Mr. Vance? Bring your lawyer. You're going to need one. The line went dead. Preston stared at the phone. He felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because he believed he could charm or bully any chairman in a room. He was a salesman, after all. He would go in there, shake the old man's hand, explain that the crypto servers were a misunderstanding, and negotiate the rent down. He convinced himself it was just a hardball negotiation tactic. He marked the date on his calendar, Friday, 9 a.m., Crush Solis. He didn't know that he wasn't scheduling a negotiation. He was scheduling his own execution. He didn't know that the chairman wasn't a man at all, and that the person waiting for him at the head of that table would be wearing the face of the woman he had discarded. The trap was no longer being set. The cage door was open, and he had just agreed to walk right inside. With the lease renewal looming like a guillotine and his company's cash flow hemorrhaging from the stock dip, Preston Vance was no longer looking for legitimate investors. The banks had tightened their purse strings after the rumors of his instability surfaced, and the reputable venture capital firms had stopped returning his calls. So, Preston did what desperate men always do. He went underground. He set up a meeting in the back room of an exclusive, members-only cigar bar in Lower Manhattan, a place known for deals that were signed in ash and handshake agreements rather than compliance paperwork. He was meeting with a consortium of shadow capital investors, men who didn't care about ethics, only returns. But Preston didn't know that the shark sitting at the end of the table was actually a dolphin working for Solis Holdings. Preston sat in the leather armchair, swirling a glass of cognac he couldn't afford to enjoy. He looked at the three men opposite him. Two were known hard money lenders, but the third man, introduced only as Mr. Kincaid, was quiet, watchful, and taking diligent notes on a tablet. Preston launched into his pitch. It was a masterclass in fraud. He told them that Vance Tech was solvent, which was a lie. He told them that the lease dispute was a clerical error that had already been resolved, which was a lie. Then, he went further. Emboldened by their silence, Preston decided to leverage the one asset he didn't actually own. He told them that the crypto mining operation on the 40th floor was a fully authorized data center partnership that was generating millions in passive income. He even offered the building's deed as collateral for the loan, claiming that his purchase of the tower was days away from closing. "I practically own the bricks," Preston boasted, puffing on a cigar. "The current landlord is just a placeholder. Once I sign the papers next week, the equity in the building alone covers your investment 3 times over." The two hard money lenders looked impressed. They nodded, greedy for the interest rates Preston was offering. But Mr. Kincaid didn't nod. He simply tapped his screen. Preston assumed he was checking the numbers. In reality, Kincaid was a forensic accountant employed by Elena Solis. Every word Preston spoke was being recorded. Every lie about the deed, every fabrication about the crypto farm, and every fraudulent promise was being uploaded directly to a secure server labeled Vance versus Solis, criminal evidence. Kincaid finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "And you can guarantee that there are no outstanding liens or legal actions against the property?" "I guarantee it personally," Preston lied without flinching, clean as a whistle. Kincaid smiled, a tight, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Excellent. We'll have the paperwork drawn up." Preston walked out of the cigar bar feeling like a god. He believed he had just secured the $5 million he needed to pay off the lease demands and float the company until the IPO. He believed he had outsmarted the system. He had no idea that he hadn't secured a loan. He had just given a sworn deposition of wire fraud to the enemy. Kincaid watched him leave, then sent a text message to Elena. He offered the building as collateral. "We have him on tape selling your property." The day before the engagement party, the Vance Tower was buzzing with a manic energy that bordered on hysteria. Preston had decided that if he was going down, he would go down looking like Louis XIV. He had turned the penthouse into a fortress of excess. Florists were hauling in thousands of white orchids, importing them from South America overnight. Ice sculptors were carving life-sized statues of Preston and Isabella in the foyer. The catering bill alone was enough to buy a small house in the suburbs. Preston was supervising the chaos, shouting orders at the staff. He was running on caffeine and adrenaline, convinced that this party would silence the haters. If he looked rich, he was rich. That was his philosophy. But beneath the surface, paranoia was eating him alive. He kept checking his phone, waiting for the money from the shadow investors to hit his account so he could pay the vendors. It hadn't arrived yet. He was writing checks that were currently bouncing, praying the float would hold for 24 hours. But his biggest fear wasn't the bank, it was the guest list. He called the head of his private security detail, a man named Gregor, into the kitchen. Preston pulled up a photo on his phone, a photo of Elena Solis. "This woman," Preston said, pointing his finger at the screen so hard he almost cracked it. "She is banned. I don't care if she has an invitation. I don't care if she says she's the Queen of England. If she steps foot in this lobby during the party, I want her thrown out onto the pavement." Physically, Gregor looked at the photo, then at Preston. Gregor had worked in this building for 10 years. He knew Elena. He knew she used to live here. He also knew the rumors swirling among the staff that the Solis on his paycheck came from her family. But Preston was the one screaming in his face, so Gregor nodded slowly. Understood, Mr. Vance. No entry for Ms. Solis. And the kid, Preston added, his voice dropping to a whisper. If she brings the boy, don't let him in either. It ruins the vibe. It was a new low even for him. Banning his own son from his home because it might ruin the vibe of his vanity party. Preston felt a surge of power giving the order. He felt safe. He believed he could control the physical space of the building just by yelling loud enough. He didn't realize that his authority was an illusion. While he was busy screaming at florists and banning his ex-wife, the building's internal systems were quietly updating. A new security protocol had been pushed to the main server by the ownership group. It flagged Elena Solis, not as a banned person, but as priority access, level 5. Preston was trying to lock the doors against the person who owned the keys, the locks, and the very ground the building stood on. He was building a castle on sand, and the tide was already coming in. The morning of the party, chaos erupted in the lobby. Preston was on his way out to pick up his custom tuxedo when he saw a commotion near the security turnstiles. A group of men in suits were arguing with the front desk. Preston approached, ready to exert his dominance, when he froze. Standing in the center of the group, looking calm and impeccable in a sharp business suit, was Elena. She wasn't trying to get into the party. It was hours away. She was trying to get to the elevators. The rookie guard at the desk, who had taken Preston's screaming orders to heart, was blocking her path. I'm sorry, ma'am. The rookie stammered, looking at a printout of Preston's banned list. Mr. Vance has strictly prohibited you from entering the premises. Preston laughed. He strode over, clapping his hands slowly. Well, trying to sneak in early to steal the silverware, Elena? Elena turned to look at him. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked bored. I have a meeting, Preston. Tell your dog to heel. My dog. Preston sneered, stepping closer. This is my building. My security. You don't have a meeting here because you don't belong here. Now get out before I have you arrested for trespassing. He turned to the rookie guard. Grab her arm. Escort her out. The rookie reached out, hesitating. But before he could touch her, a booming voice echoed across the marble lobby. Stand down. It was the head of building security, not Preston's private hire, but the man employed by the building management. He marched over, his face pale. He physically shoved the rookie guard away from Elena. Then, to Preston's absolute shock, the head of security turned to Elena and bowed his head slightly. My apologies, Ms. Solis, the head of security said, his voice trembling. New staff. He wasn't briefed on the protocols. Please, go right ahead. I've unlocked the Executive Express elevator for you. Preston stood there, his mouth agape. His brain couldn't process the image. The head of security just shoved a guard for obeying Preston's orders? Hey, Preston shouted, grabbing the head of security's shoulder. I told you to ban her. You work for me. I want her out. The head of security brushed Preston's hand off his uniform with a look of disdain. He turned to Preston, his eyes cold. I don't work for you, Mr. Vance. I work for the building. And Ms. Solis, she has clearance that supersedes yours. That's impossible. Preston screamed, his face turning purple. I'm the penthouse tenant. I'm the highest clearance in the tower. You're fired. You hear me? You're done. The head of security smiled, a dry, humorless smile. You can't fire me, Mr. Vance. You don't sign my checks. Now, step aside, or I will have you removed for harassing a priority guest. Elena walked past Preston without even looking at him. She stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on Preston's confused, enraged face. He stood in the lobby, humiliated in front of his own staff. He couldn't understand it. He assumed Elena must be sleeping with the head of security. That had to be it. It was the only explanation his twisted mind could accept. He stormed out of the lobby, vowing to have the entire security team replaced by morning, completely unaware that he had just been overruled by his own landlady in the lobby of his future property. Preston Vance believed he had finally found the smoking gun. Sitting in his office, staring at the high-resolution photos his private investigator had just emailed, he felt a surge of malicious triumph that nearly made him dizzy. The photos showed Elena dining at Le Cuckoo, one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. She wasn't alone. She was seated across from an older, distinguished man with silver hair and a bespoke suit. In one photo, the man was handing Elena a document. In another, he was laughing and patting her hand. To Preston's warped mind, the narrative was obvious. This was the sugar daddy. This was the man funding her lifestyle, paying for the lawyers, and pulling strings with the building security. Preston didn't recognize the man, which convinced him even further that this was some shady, underground financier or perhaps a lonely widower Elena had manipulated. He decided he wouldn't just keep this information to himself. He would use it to nuke her reputation before she could cause any more trouble. He did something that no CEO of a public company should ever do. He leaked the photos to a tabloid blog himself. He sent them anonymously with a caption, "Ex-girlfriend of tech mogul Preston Vance spotted with mystery geriatric lover who is funding her attacks on Vance Tech." He hit send, leaned back in his chair, and waited for the internet to tear her apart. He imagined the comments calling her a gold digger. He imagined the shame she would feel. He poured himself a drink, celebrating his tactical genius. 2 hours later, his phone blew up. But it wasn't congratulations. It was his PR manager, and she was screaming. "What have you done?" she shrieked. "Did you send those photos? The metadata traces back to your office IP address." "So what?" Preston laughed. "Let the world know she's sleeping her way to the middle." "You idiot," the manager yelled. "That's not a mystery lover. That is Arthur Sterling. He's the chairman of the board for the Solis Real Estate Group. He's 75 years old, happily married for 50 years, and he's the most feared litigator in New York history. You just accused the head of the company that owns your building of soliciting prostitution." Preston dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor. He scrambled to his computer. The blog post was viral, but the comments weren't attacking Elena. They were laughing at Preston. The business community had instantly recognized Arthur Sterling, a man known for his ruthless integrity. The headline had been updated. Vance Tech CEO accuses landlord's chairman of affair in bizarre meltdown. Preston had tried to paint Elena as a whore. Instead, he had just publicly defamed the one man who had the power to sign his eviction order. His phone rang again. It was a direct line from Sterling's office. Preston didn't answer. He couldn't. He stared at the screen, realizing that the document Sterling was handing Elena in the photo wasn't a check for sex. It was likely the strategy for Preston's total destruction. He had poked the bear, and the bear was now coming for his head. The irony of the weather was lost on no one but Preston. As the day of the engagement party faded into evening, another storm front collided with the city. It wasn't as violent as the one that had accompanied Elena's eviction, but it was gloomier, a heavy, relentless gray rain that turned the skyline into a blurred watercolor of misery. Inside the penthouse, the mood matched the sky. The florists had finished setting up, but the flowers looked funereal in the dim light. The staff moved silently, terrified of Preston's unpredictable temper. Preston was alone in the living room. Isabella had locked herself in the master bedroom hours ago, claiming a migraine, though Preston suspected she was just avoiding the fallout from the Arthur Sterling scandal. His phone was silent now. The investors had stopped calling. The congratulatory texts had ceased. He felt an intense, crushing isolation. He looked out the window at the rain, and for the first time, he remembered Elena standing on that street corner. He didn't feel guilt. He was incapable of it, but he felt a nagging sense that the roles were reversing. He needed to feel powerful again. He needed to hear fear in someone's voice. So he called Elena. He expected her to be rattled by the photos, despite the backlash. He expected her to be cowering. When she answered, however, there was no background noise of a cheap motel TV or traffic. There was only the soft hum of classical music and the clinking of fine china. "What do you want, Preston?" she asked, sounding bored. "I just wanted to make sure you saw the news." Preston lied, his voice slurring slightly from the scotch. "Everyone is talking about you and that old man. You're a joke, Elena. You're embarrassing, Leo. The only person embarrassed today is your PR team, Preston," Elena replied calmly. "Mr. Sterling found your little blog post quite amusing. He's added a defamation of character clause to the lawsuit. The settlement figure just went up by another 10 million. Preston gripped the phone tight. "There is no lawsuit. I'm going to sign the lease renewal on Friday, and then I'm going to buy the building, and I'm going to evict you from the city." "You're not buying anything," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "I'm looking at your financials right now, Preston. I have your bank statements on my screen. You're overdrawn. You're floating checks to the caterers. You're broke." "How? How do you have my statements?" Preston whispered, terror finally piercing his drunken haze. "I told you," Elena said softly. "The landlord sees everything. Enjoy the party, Preston. It's the last time you'll ever host anything in that zip code. And by the way, turn off the living room lights. You're wasting electricity, and I hate waste. Preston froze. He looked around the empty room. The lights flickered once, then died, plunging him into darkness again. She was watching him. She was controlling his world. He screamed into the darkness, hurling the phone at the wall, but the silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. While Preston was screaming in the dark living room, a different kind of betrayal was happening in the master bedroom. Isabella wasn't suffering from a migraine. She was suffering from a sudden realization that her meal ticket was about to bounce. She had heard Preston's screaming phone calls. She had seen the news about the failed investors. She had intercepted the final notice letters from the credit card companies that Preston tried to hide in his desk. Isabella was a mercenary. She had no loyalty to a sinking ship. She sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by Louis Vuitton luggage, not fully packed, but open, ready. She held her phone, looking at a number she had dug out of Preston's old contact list. It was Elena's number. She debated the call. If Preston went down, Isabella would be collateral damage. She would be the fiancée of the disgraced fraudster. Her social standing would be incinerated. Unless she flipped. She pressed call. "This is Elena." "It's Isabella," she whispered, keeping her voice low so Preston wouldn't hear through the door. There was a long silence on the other end. "I have nothing to say to you," Elena said coldly. "Wait," Isabella pleaded. "Listen, I know what's happening. I know he's broke. I know you're the one doing it. Look, I can help you. I have access to his safe. I know where he keeps the hard drives with the unencrypted crypto ledgers. I can give you everything you need to send him to jail." "And what do you want in exchange?" Elena asked. "Immunity," Isabella said quickly. "And maybe a severance package? Enough to get me to Europe and start over. I can be your inside man. I can testify that he forced me to stay. Just give me a way out." Isabella waited, holding her breath. She thought it was a fair trade. She thought Elena would jump at the chance to have the fiancé turn on him. But Elena Solis wasn't looking for shortcuts. "You stood there," Elena said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "You sat on that sofa and drank champagne while he threw a 5-year-old boy into a hurricane. You laughed when he told me to go to a shelter. You aren't a victim, Isabella. You're an accomplice." I was scared of him," Isabella lied. "No, you were greedy," Elena corrected. "I don't need your help to destroy him. I already have him. And when the ship goes down, you're going to be on the deck right next to him. Don't call me again." The line clicked dead. Isabella stared at the phone, stunned. She had been rejected. There was no lifeboat. She looked at the open suitcases. She realized she couldn't wait for a deal. She had to run. She started throwing clothes into the bag frantically. She stripped the diamond engagement ring off her finger. It was probably fake anyway, or bought on credit, and left it on the nightstand. She didn't say goodbye. She slipped out the back service entrance of the penthouse suite, the same way Elena had been forced out, disappearing into the night before the repo men, or the FBI, came knocking. Preston was now truly, completely alone. The night before his execution, the condemned man usually prays, but Preston Vance spent the evening rehearsing his victory speech in the mirror. The penthouse was silent, a hollow, echoing tomb of glass and steel. Isabella was gone. He had found her engagement ring sitting on the nightstand next to a half-packed suitcase she had abandoned in her haste. There was no note, just the empty space where her perfume bottles used to be. A normal man would have been devastated. A normal man would have realized that if the mercenary leaves, the war is already lost. But Preston stared at the ring and felt a twisted sense of relief. He convinced himself that she was weak. She was dead weight. He told his reflection that greatness required solitude. He poured the last of the scotch, the expensive bottle he had been saving for the wedding, and paced the living room floor. He began to role-play the meeting with Chairman Solis. He spoke to the empty air, practicing his intimidation tactics. He would walk in, throw his weight around, threaten to move his company to a competitor's building, and demand a rent reduction. He would charm the old man, or he would crush him. He checked his suit for the morning, a custom Navy bespoke cut that cost $12,000. It was his armor. As long as he looked like a winner, the reality of his bank account didn't matter. He didn't sleep. He spent the hours between 3 a.m. and dawn reviewing his fabricated financial reports, convincing himself that the numbers were real. By the time the sun rose over the city, casting a blood-red light through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Preston was in a state of manic confidence. He believed his own lies. He believed he was going to walk into that boardroom and walk out the owner of the building. He took the elevator down to the garage. His Aston Martin was gone, repossessed during the night by a towing company that had used a master key. Preston stared at the empty parking spot, his eye twitching. He didn't let himself scream. He simply adjusted his cufflinks and called a black car service, putting it on a corporate account that was already flagged for fraud. To Solis headquarters, he told the driver. And wait for me. I'll be buying the building, so I won't be long. He sat in the back seat, watching the city pass by, visualizing his victory. He imagined Elena somewhere in a shelter, crying over her poor choices. He imagined Leo growing up and reading about his father's triumph in textbooks. He arrived at the massive, limestone headquarters of Solis Holdings at 8:55 a.m., exactly on time. He walked up the steps, ignoring the heaviness in his gut. He was walking into a lion's den with a stake tied around his neck, believing he was the zookeeper. The boardroom on the top floor of Solis Holdings was less of a meeting place and more of a throne room. The table was 30 feet long, hewn from a single slab of black walnut. The windows offered a panoramic view of the entire city, including the Vance Tower, which looked like a toy from this height. When Preston Vance walked in, expecting to see a doddering old man and a weary secretary, he was met with a scene that should have made him turn around and run. The room was full, and it wasn't just lawyers. Seated along the left side of the table were the three partners of Sterling, Cooper, and Katz, the sharks he had heard rumors about. They sat with perfect posture, their eyes fixed on documents, not even acknowledging his entry. On the right side of the room, standing against the wall, were four reporters from the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and Bloomberg. They held notepads and recorders. Preston paused at the door. Why was the press here? A lease renewal was a private business matter. His heart hammered against his ribs. He forced a smile, striding into the room with false bravado. "Gentlemen," Preston announced, his voice booming too loudly in the acoustically dampened room. "I see we have an audience. I assume you brought the press to announce my acquisition of the property? A bit premature, but I like the enthusiasm." No one laughed. No one smiled. The reporters just stared at him with the kind of morbid curiosity usually reserved for car crash victims. The lead lawyer, Mr. Katz, simply gestured to the empty chair at the foot of the table, the seat for the petitioner. "Please sit, Mr. Vance," Katz said, his voice dry as dust. "The chairman will be with us shortly." Preston bristled. He hated being made to wait. He hated the foot of the table. He marched over and sat down, throwing his leather portfolio onto the wood with a thud. "Let's get this over with. I have a company to run. Where is Mr. Solis? Is he napping?" "The chairman is reviewing the final eviction protocols," Katz said, not looking up. "Eviction?" Preston laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "We're here for a renewal, Katz. Don't play hardball with me. I know the market. You need me. I'm the anchor tenant." The room remained silent. The air was thick, charged with static electricity. Preston looked around, feeling the sweat trickle down his back. He checked his watch. 9:05 a.m. He tapped his fingers on the table. "This is disrespectful," Preston muttered. "If he's not here in 2 minutes, I'm walking." "You aren't walking anywhere, Preston," a reporter whispered from the side, scribbling something down. Preston spun around to snap at the journalist, but before he could speak, the heavy double doors at the far end of the room, the doors leading to the chairman's private suite, clicked. The sound was distinct. The heavy brass latch lifted. The entire room went deadly silent. The lawyers stopped reading. The reporters raised their cameras. Everyone stood up. Preston remained seated, confused. Why were they standing? Was it the president? The doors swung open. It wasn't an old man with a cane. It wasn't a corporate suit. The figure standing in the doorway was silhouetted by the light from the office behind her, but the silhouette was unmistakably feminine. She stepped into the room, and the sound of her heels on the hardwood floor was a rhythmic, sharp click-clack that sounded like a countdown. She was wearing a white power suit, impeccably tailored, sharp enough to cut glass. Her hair, usually worn in a messy bun during her mom years, was sleek, straight, and glossy. She wore no jewelry except for a simple platinum pin on her lapel, the Solis family crest. Preston squinted. His brain refused to process the visual data. He knew that face. He knew the shape of those eyes. But the context was impossible. That was Elena. That was the woman he had thrown into the ring. That was the woman who clipped coupons. That was the woman who scrubbed his floors. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Elena? What are you doing here? Did you crash the meeting? He looked frantically at the security guards by the door. Get her out of here. She's crazy. She's my stalker ex. The guards didn't move. They stood at attention, eyes forward, respectful. Elena didn't look at Preston. She didn't even blink. She walked past the lawyers, who bowed their heads in reverence as she passed. She walked past the reporters, who began snapping photos rapidly, the flashbulbs exploding like strobes. She walked the length of the long table, closing the distance between his delusion and her reality. Preston started to laugh, a manic, broken laugh. This is a joke, right? Did you sleep with the chairman? Is that it? You're the secretary. Elena reached the head of the table, the chairman's seat, the massive leather chair that looked like a throne. She placed her hands on the back of it. She finally looked at him. Her eyes were colder than the storm he had evicted her into. Sit down, Mr. Vance, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. It was the voice of someone who owned the air he was breathing. I'm not sitting until you tell me where Mr. Solis is. Preston shouted, pointing a shaking finger at her. I want to speak to the owner. Elena pulled the chair out and sat down. She clasped her hands on the table. She looked at the lawyers, then at the press, and finally, she pinned Preston with a gaze that stripped him naked. My father passed away 10 years ago, Preston, she said, her voice echoing in the silent room. I have been the chairman of Solis Holdings for a decade. I own the building. I own the bank that holds your debt. I own the lawyers sitting to your left. And as of this morning, she reached into a folder and pulled out a single red document. I own you. Preston's knees gave out. He collapsed back into his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The reality crashed down on him with the force of a collapsing skyscraper. The woman he had bullied, the woman he had called provincial, the woman he had discarded, she was the $4 billion landlord. And he had just spent the last month declaring war on her. Now, Elena said, opening the file. Let's discuss the damages to my property. Preston Vance sat in the chair, his face the color of wet ash, as the realization of his catastrophe settled over him like a shroud. He tried to speak, tried to form the words to explain that this was a misunderstanding, but his throat was dry. Elena didn't give him the chance to recover. She tapped a button on the console built into the table, and the massive screen behind her, covering the entire north wall, flickered to life. It wasn't a PowerPoint presentation about rent increases. It was a forensic dissection of Preston's life. You asked for a meeting to discuss the lease, Elena said, her voice cutting through the silence. So let's discuss it. Specifically, Section 8, Paragraph 4, unauthorized commercial activity. On the screen, a heat map of the Vance Tower appeared. The 40th floor was glowing a bright, angry red. Next to it were photos taken inside the storage unit. Photos of racks upon racks of unauthorized crypto mining servers, humming and stealing electricity from the building's main grid. Preston gasped. He recognized the angle of the photos. They were taken from the ceiling vents. You have been stealing $1.2 million of electricity annually from Solis Holdings, Elena stated, looking at the documents. That is grand larceny, Preston. But that's just the beginning. The screen changed. It showed a video clip. It was Preston at the cigar bar, sitting with the shadow investors. The audio played clearly over the boardroom speakers. I practically own the bricks. The current landlord is just a placeholder. The reporters in the room gasped, their pens flying across their notepads. Preston looked around wildly, seeing his own words hanging in the air like a noose. He realized the quiet man at the end of the table that night hadn't been an investor. He had been a spy. Wire fraud. Elena continued, listing the crimes as if she were reading a grocery list. Attempting to pledge assets you do not own as collateral for a high-risk loan. The SEC is going to find this recording very interesting, Preston. Preston finally found his voice. It was a high, desperate squeak. Elena, wait. Please. We can work this out. I did it for us. For the company. I was going to pay you back once the IPO launched. You know me. I'm a builder. I take risks. You didn't do it for us, Elena corrected him, her eyes narrowing. You evicted us into a storm. remember? She tapped the console one last time. The video on the screen changed. It was grainy, black and white footage from the security camera in the penthouse foyer. The date stamp was 2 weeks ago. The room watched in horrified silence as the video showed Preston Vance physically shoving a woman and a small boy toward a service elevator. They watched him point at the storm outside. They watched him laugh. The reporters were no longer writing. They were staring at Preston with pure disgust. In the court of public opinion, financial fraud was one thing, but throwing a child into a hurricane was a death sentence. Preston shrank into his chair, wishing the floor would open up and swallow him whole. He realized that Elena hadn't just brought lawyers to evict him. She had brought the press to bury him. The video froze on the image of Leo's terrified face looking back at his father. Elena stared at the frozen frame for a moment, letting the shame saturate the room, before turning back to the trembling man at the foot of the table. "My father wrote the standard lease for the Vance Tower 40 years ago," Elena said softly. "He was a man of principle. He included a specific clause that most tenants ignore because they assume it's archaic. The morality clause." She signaled to Mr. Katz, the lead attorney. Katz stood up and read from the heavy binder in front of him. "The landlord reserves the right to immediate, summary eviction without notice if the tenant engages in conduct that is illegal, immoral, or endangers the welfare of minors within the premises." Katz closed the binder with a snap. "Mr. Vance, your actions on the night of the storm, combined with the confirmed grand larceny of electricity, constitute a breach of the morality clause. The lease is void. Effective immediately." Preston stood up, shaking. "Void? You can't just void it. I have rights. I have a business to run. You can't kick me out today." "Actually," Elena said, leaning forward, "I can. And I am. But because I am not the monster you are, Preston, I am going to give you more than you gave me." Preston looked at her, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. He thought she was going to offer a settlement. He thought she was going to give him a month to find a new place. He thought his charm still held some power over her. "I gave you 5 minutes to pack," Preston whispered, remembering his own cruelty. "Exactly," Elena said. "So I'm giving you 1 hour. You have 60 minutes to vacate the penthouse and the corporate offices. Anything left behind after 60 minutes becomes the property of Solis Holdings to be sold at auction for charity." 1 hour? Preston screamed. "I have servers. I have files. I have millions of dollars of art. I can't move a company in an hour." "Then you better start running," Elena said, checking her watch. "Your time started 2 minutes ago. And Preston, the elevators are disabled for you. You'll have to use the stairs." Preston looked at the faces in the room, the lawyers who were smiling, the reporters who were already uploading their stories, and Elena, who looked like a queen on her throne. He realized there was no negotiation. There was no mercy. He turned and ran. He sprinted out of the boardroom, his expensive shoes slipping on the floor, bursting through the doors in a blind panic. He had 58 minutes to save the scraps of his life before the locks changed forever. Elena watched him go. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply picked up her phone and dialed the building manager. "He's coming," she said. "Make sure the service elevator is the only exit available. Let him leave the way he made me leave." Preston Vance had spent his entire adult life avoiding physical exertion, viewing it as something for the lower classes. But now he was sweating through his $12,000 suit as he scrambled down the emergency stairwell. He had tried to take the elevator, but the panel had simply flashed "access denied" in mocking red letters. He had 45 minutes left. He burst onto the penthouse floor, gasping for air, expecting to find his sanctuary waiting for him. Instead, he found a scene of organized dismantling. Security guards, building security, not his own, were already standing by the doors. They weren't there to help him pack. They were there to ensure he didn't damage the property. Preston rushed into the bedroom, frantically grabbing handfuls of watches, cash, and jewelry, stuffing them into pillowcases like a common burglar in his own home. He screamed at the guards to help him, offering them thousands of dollars to carry his art collection down to the street. The guards didn't move. One of them, a man Preston had walked past for 3 years without ever saying hello to, checked his watch and coolly informed Preston that he had 30 minutes remaining before the locks were recoded. The humiliation was visceral. Preston dragged a heavy suitcase. the same vintage leather one he had forced Elena to use, across the marble floors. He tried to grab his framed magazine covers, the trophies of his ego, but they were too heavy. He had to choose, his vanity or his liquidity. He dropped the frames, the glass shattering on the floor, and chose the cash. At the 59-minute mark, Preston Vance stood at the service elevator. It was the only door that would open for him. He was laden with bags, sweating, disheveled, and manic. The staff of the building, the maids, the janitors, the maintenance crew he had terrorized for years, had gathered in the hallway. They didn't say a word. They just watched. It was a silent tribunal. Preston tried to muster one last glare, one last scrap of arrogance, but it crumbled under the weight of their collective judgment. The service elevator doors opened with a groan. The smell of trash and stale air hit him, the exact same scent that had greeted Elena and Leo 2 weeks ago. Preston dragged his bags inside. There was no chauffeur waiting. There was no assistant to hold the door. As the steel doors slid shut, cutting off his view of the penthouse forever, Preston Vance realized that he wasn't leaving a home. He was being excised like a tumor. The ride down was slow, agonizing, and lonely. The service door opened onto the back alley, and the harsh light of midday hit Preston like a physical blow. It wasn't storming this time. The sun was shining brightly, which somehow made it worse. The storm had offered Elena a cloak of darkness for her misery. The sunlight offered Preston nowhere to hide. He stumbled out onto the pavement, his bags spilling onto the dirty concrete. He looked around for his car, for a taxi, for anything. But the world had already seen the live stream. A group of pedestrians walking by stopped. They pointed. They whispered. Someone pulled out a phone and started filming. Preston Vance, the tech mogul, was standing in a pile of garbage bags behind his own building, looking like a madman. He lunged at the person filming, shouting at them to stop, but he tripped over his own luggage and fell to his knees. The video of his fall would be a meme within the hour. He scrambled for his phone to call Isabella, to call his lawyer, to call anyone. But his phone was dead. The company account had been suspended. The service cut. He was digitally erased. He looked up at the towering glass structure of the Vance Tower. No, the Solis Tower. It gleamed in the sunlight, impenetrable and indifferent to his ruin. 70 floors up, standing on the balcony of the penthouse, Elena Solis watched the tiny figure on the pavement below. She held Leo in her arms. The boy was pointing at the street, asking if that was Daddy. Elena didn't lie to him. She stroked his hair and told him that yes, that was his father, and that he was going on a very long time out because he hadn't learned how to share or be kind. She didn't feel joy. She didn't feel the thrill of revenge she thought she would. She felt a profound sense of balance. The scales had tipped back. She turned away from the edge, carrying her son back into the warmth of their home. She ordered the building manager to have the name, Vance, removed from the facade immediately. She didn't want to see it when she looked out the window. Preston was still screaming at the pedestrians below, but up here, the air was clear and the silence was golden. 6 months later, the skyline of the city had changed. The letters spelling Vance had been stripped from the tower, replaced by a modest but elegant bronze plaque near the entrance that read, "The Leo Building." Inside, the culture had shifted entirely. The oppressive atmosphere of fear was gone, replaced by a quiet efficiency. Elena Solis sat in the office that used to be Preston's, though she had removed the throne-like chair and the mirrored walls. The space was now filled with light, plants, and photos of her son. She wasn't just running a real estate empire. She was running a revolution. She had launched a foundation for single mothers facing eviction, funded entirely by the liquidated assets of Vance Tech, which she had acquired for pennies on the dollar after the SEC investigation shattered the company's stock. As for Preston Vance, the city had a short memory. He hadn't gone to prison. The white-collar laws were slippery enough for him to avoid jail time. But he had been sentenced to something far worse for a narcissist, irrelevance. Bankrupt, blacklisted, and stripped of his reputation, he had moved to a mid-sized city in the Midwest, where nobody knew who he was. Rumor had it he was managing a used car dealership, trying to convince customers that a 2015 sedan was a luxury investment. He lived in a small apartment. He paid his rent on time. He checked the weather forecast obsessively before every storm. Elena finished her meeting with the board and walked down to the lobby. The doorman, the same man Preston had threatened to fire, smiled and held the door open for her. She thanked him by name. She walked out onto the street, holding Leo's hand as they headed to the park. They passed the spot where the old Starlight Motel used to be. Elena had bought that too and was turning it into a shelter. The story of the billionaire who evicted his family had faded from the headlines, replaced by the next scandal. But the lesson remained etched in the stone of the building itself. Elena looked up at the tower one last time before turning her attention to her son. She realized that Preston's mistake wasn't just underestimating her wealth. It was underestimating the physics of life. He thought he could build a skyscraper on the backs of people he hurt, forgetting that the higher you build without a foundation of kindness, the harder you fall when the landlord finally comes to collect the rent. If you enjoyed seeing justice served ice cold, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments, do you think Preston deserved jail time, or was losing his ego a worse punishment? See you in the next story.